Hello and welcome to the 28th Annual Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit organization housed within Eastern Washington University. Our program is responsible for Get Lit, Washington State's longest-running annual literary festival. We host dozens of free and low-cost readings, craft classes, panel discussions, a full book fair, and more every April in downtown Spokane. This year, we're thrilled to be joined by headliners Tessa Hulls, Willie Vlaughton, and Keisha Kuipers, alongside 60 other talented writers from across our region and beyond. You can find a full schedule of all in-person and virtual events, along with information about all of our festival authors, by visiting our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to welcome Mackenzie Draper, GetLit's Assistant Coordinator, to introduce today's event.
Thank you, Kate. We have with us today three accomplished clinician poets to present This Mortal Coil, the poet in the clinical realm. Michele Bombardier, Risa Denenberg, and Jed Myers, who have decades of professional experience in clinical fields, will read to us from their most recent works and explore the relationship between poetry and compassion and what it looks like on a craft level to write about disability and illness, death and dying, and the complexities of the clinical relationship. Now I'll hand it back over to Kate to introduce our first reader.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Michele Bombardier is the author of Don't Ask Me How I Know, which was runner-up for the Sally Albiso Award from Moonpath Press, and What We Do, finalist for the Washington Book Award. She is the winner of the 2024 Norwood Prize in Poetry and is the inaugural Poet Laureate of Bainbridge Island. Recent work has appeared in New Ohio Review, JAMA, Crab Creek Review, and others. She has received fellowships and support from Humanities Washington, Hedgebrook, Mineral School, Edith Wharton Residency, Centrum, and the Tyrone Guthrie Center. She is the founder of Fish Plate Poetry, where she leads poetry workshops and retreats. Please welcome Michele.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. And hello, Get Lit. I'm thrilled to be here. My first poem is, I'm going to primarily be reading from my new book, Don't Ask Me How I Know. This poem is called Statistic. She loved pink shoelaces in her tennis shoes, wore pink fluffy sweaters and sparkly nail polish, more pink yet. She loved her name, Alexandria, said it made her feel like a queen and therefore improved her posture. She loved fantasy novels, video games, magic tricks. She loved firefighters and wanted to be one. She loved it when she moved into her own apartment, got her own set of dishes, a small TV, matching set of towels, and her cat, Buster, even though he bit sometimes. She loved grilled cheese and ham sandwiches, daisies, vanilla candles, played Pink all the time, although she liked the name more than the music. She laughed loudly with her head thrown back. Once she gave herself a haircut, her bangs so lopsided she kept her head tilted for weeks. She was funny. She could roll her eyes like nobody's business. She was 21, died 3 months before she was to meet her birth mother, 2 months after her third bout of COVID, 1 month before her birthday. She hadn't been able to smell anything the last year of her life. My next poem is called The Mask, and here's a visual. The Mask. Before hospitals had computers, we had billing slips, yellow strips of paper that floated from clinician to front desk to post office to insurance. I discovered I could sweep away the tracks of the paper trail for the uninsured by feeding the yellow sheets into the mouth of the shredder. When my patient lost his job, along with his speech after a stroke, I pirated over 4 months of therapy before my supervisor noticed the tangle of yellow in my trash can. Then someone else managed my billing. On our last session, my patient brought me a gift. A clay mask small enough to fit in my palm, painted and carved, burnt slit for eyes and a downward half-moon mouth. Almost 40 years it sat on my writing desk. I keep it within reach, faded, chipped, the pain etched into the face undiminished. Why do I love it? Black ash remains in the eyes. It's beautiful and awful. I remember I felt I'd failed my patient. He regained so few words, which he gathered like a bouquet to thank me. And this next poem is called Short Flight in a Small Room. I liked my nurse immediately. Ramrod posture, slight swagger, dragon tattoos. When she took my hand between her blue gloved ones, said, "Squeeze me when it hurts, I can take it." I was surprised to feel lifted as if in a basket, and she was the balloon. The doctors darted about the room, white winged and capped, goggled and muffled. I was both out of my body and in, my breast punctured and radiated, gripped in its plastic cage, but far below me, as if held captive in some hidden valley. The machines made their shooting noises. Eyes above masks narrowed and searched through the periscope into my depths, but hers stayed soft and I kept tethered. I wonder if the soul sometimes rocks itself loose from its warm, bloodied house. I wonder if it flies in short bursts, like the golden crowned sparrow singing its steady but lilting three-note song. And then my last poem is from my book, What We Do. And this poem is called Sisterhood. When the chaplain met me in pre-op, she said she too had reconstruction. When I asked, "Can I see?" the older woman lifted her blouse without hesitation. When I said, "Can I feel it?" she took my hand and held it to her chest. What I remembered later was the living pulse of the chaplain's heart beating against my palm, and the urgent song of my own heartbeat keeping time against her hand. Later, the chaplain told me she remembered the eyes of the nurse and doctor turned away, a new lightness in her own chest, warmth radiating from the scar across her breast. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Our next reader is Risa Denenberg. Risa lives on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, where she works as a nurse practitioner and volunteers with End of Life Washington. She is a co-founder of Headmistress Press, publisher of books of poetry by lesbian identified women, and curator at the Poetry Cafe Online, a space where poetry chapbooks are celebrated and reviewed. She has published 8 collections of poetry, most recently Posthuman, finalist for the 2020 Floating Bridge Chapbook Contest, and Rain Dweller, finalist for the Sally Albiso Prize. She is currently working on a memoir titled I'll Look for You at Moonrise, about losing custody of her son. Please welcome Risa.
Hi, and thank you for having us. I'm going to be reading poems from Rain Dweller, which is my most recent book, came out in 23. And the first poem I'm going to be reading is called Body of Well-Known Naturalist Found in River. And this was a found headline. A woman wanders to escape. Her noetic life has dwindled down to grandchildren she never sees and to failure to remember their names. She retains an ossified memory of the taxonomy of birds, but has lost her car keys for the last time. She mismates the buttons on her flannel shirt. There is no one to straighten it or care, no one to straighten her affairs, not the trysts of midlife, but the sort that bury you under piles of mail in your 70s. Physically, she is strong with steady heart and unburnt lungs. She can hike for hours, wielding a hand-carved walking stick, backpack not a burden, canvas for shade or to lie upon, enough water for a day. She roams the path along the river where she knows the flora and the pitch of bird calls. The once weekly chat with her daughter came this morning at 10. She no longer looks forward to these calls, but does her best to fake it. Pleasantries were tendered and repaid. No hint was given of any plan or prayer. In the river, tiny islets open within eddies as she slides from bank to current with a splash. She is a perfect pear-shaped, sea-bound droplet. And I'm going to read another, the next poem is called Fragrance of Crushed Fruit. And it is on page 77. There it is. Fragrance of Crushed Fruit for Mary A. Another patient died today. I know the scent, a scent I know well, but not at all, crumpled into a promise made 5 years ago when it was time to retire, to go on at least until she died, never planning beyond this moment. I can't describe this feeling, the way clouds claim nothing as they darken into rain. I waited expectantly, impatient at times, for suffering to end, but hers or mine. Does it comfort the family to say now the heavy lifting is over? How her longing for heaven softened that bed? Tears surprised me today. I held back so much for so long. I'm scored along my edges, chest ripe for rending. Yet haven't I walked this path before, strewn with the cloying scent of Easter lilies, my own left behind longings, my litany of corpses? Dare I count them? O death, you are not a river, but I have careened your banks my whole career, studying your silences, submitting to your elegies. But who can know the sorrows of another? I choke over words, feel the soft stir of her in the air. And isn't this fragrance her must, the crushed fruit of her? O death, walking past you, so often I look the other way, ask the buried to forgive the inelegant clatter of my steps, big sunflowers in the field to hide their yellow faces. I have my stash of powder, the knowledge, also patience. Finding something to live for is my talent, this small raft. And the last poem I'm going to read is 20 Years of Dead, and it's an elegy for my best friend John, who died of AIDS in 1993. And 20 Years of Dead was written 10 years ago, so it's really 30 years of dead. There's not a lot of love that isn't brutal, but we had our East Village dives that didn't open for Sunday liquid brunch until 1 p.m. and Monday nights at the Gay and Lesbian Community Center where all the boys were cruising and you hung out with me anyway. And your pate, your miraculous leg of lamb, your 100 layers of phyllo, and your 10 plagues, the infusions that didn't kill the germ that killed you. And how after I met your parents, and after I found the shoebox of postcards of martyred saints and the slush pile of short stories that you wrote in college, I read your journals. I should never have read your journals. Your love was hilarious and full of grand gestures and caution tossed and Christ, how we could talk smart and fast like two Jews do. I could meet up with you after an AA meeting, count on you to say, "Good God, girl, you need a drink," because you knew you were going to die. And you could say something so brain sick as, "After I die, I want you to burn my body in the street and eat my flesh." Thank you.
Thanks so much, Risa. That was beautiful. Our final reader is Jed Myers, whose fourth book of poetry, Can't Be Far, was a finalist for the Sally Albiso Award. His prior collections are Learning to Hold, winner of the Wandering Angus Press Editors Award, The Marriage of Space and Time, Watching the Perseids, which won the Sacramento Poetry Center Book Award, and 6 chapbooks. Recent honors include the Northwest Review Poetry Prize, the River Heron Poetry Prize, and the Sundress Chapbook Editor's Choice Award. Poems have appeared in Rattle, Rhino, Poetry Northwest, Southern Indiana Review, the Southeast Review, Greensboro Review, and other journals and anthologies. He lives in Seattle, where he's the editor of the journal Bracken. Please welcome Jed.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you, Get Lit, for having us and having me here. This is very, very uplifting. I'm going to read first a poem from The Marriage of Space and Time. It's called In the Shade by the Water, and it's for my daughter. Our sorrows meet in one shadow, one stream, like the ravine creek we'd follow when you were small. I'm back there in my daydream, your hand in mine under the tall summer trees, still cool midday on the path along our little river. You crouch over slugs, stroke the moss coats on the earth and alder trunks, talk silk architecture among the spiders, squawk with the crows as they laugh at their own jokes. Eternally cool here below the sun-cooked bungalows. Home we'd walk from, it's no more. I left you. Let the screen door swat the jam as I strode off alone. Years before you could leave too. Left you in that quiet cavern, floor bared of my Persian rugs, fridge groaning its hunger from inside the kitchen. Over the spent wine bottles, fruit flies in clouds like ghosts of roses I'd brought you and Mom. You're welcome to a new loneliness. I wouldn't let myself see it then. Now you're across town, a rundown shared rental, more life in it, more laughter. You've had me there once, here in the shade by the water, where both our sorrows flow. You step out of your shoes as you would to wade. I still don't know how to atone. Your feet slip into the cold on the stones. And I'd like to read a poem from Learning to Hold. The poem begins with a title, The Humility of Old Men. Might gout a big toe, might turn an ankle whose ligament got loosed up years ago under a basket, might wear through the cartilage of a right knee on its way to a hip's ball and socket, and on from there it'll flaccid the groin's passion gear, find a pocket of bowel to inflame. It will infiltrate the diaphragm and make camp in the heart, tighten the arteries, stiffen the lungs, and steepen the hills. It will ascend and drill itself into the pulp of teeth, pull down the shoulders, brittle the neck, cloud the eyes, yellow the world. Humility shrinks old men sometimes to a ripeness of friends with death, kind of translucence, lets us see the well-traveled child who smiles at me from his hospital bed. And one more for now from my newest collection, Can't Be Far. This is a poem from the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's called Anyone's Dust. and the epigraph is simply following the Kakhovka dam blast. I'm distanced, speechless. My tongue will not reach the front line of my teeth. People crouch on sudden rooftop islands in Kherson where the Dnipro widens. I've got my hat on in the kitchen. When did that happen? Am I going somewhere? There, an emergency train came in. Some made it on. I've lowered my lids. I know, had I grown into the skin of any one of those saboteurs, I'd have planted the same bomb. And, suckled on twisted history, I'd aim the missiles to pulverize my neighbors' hospitals. I'd have been guzzling other facts. But on screen, at my table, an old woman, to her shins in brown water in her house, huddles two lean dogs trying to climb her out of the icy wash. Here, June sun spills through the panes and drenches bright the 10 million specks that float and sink like silt or ash in the air, stunned powder of things. Each tumbling fleck of this dust could be anyone's. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jed. Now I'll give the floor over to Michele.
Thank you again. You know, I realize that between the three of us, we have over 120 collective years of experience. That's pretty remarkable. I'm going to talk about some craft aspects of writing about illness and disability. Risa will talk about aspects of writing on death and dying, and Jed will talk to us about complexities of the clinical relationship. So I worked for almost 37 years as a speech and language pathologist, as a neurological and developmental specialist. Poetry made me a better clinician, and being a clinician has deepened my poetry. Data shows us that poetry is good for clinicians. It helps us with stress and improves compassion, which is why I have also pursued narrative medicine. I spent decades working in hospital and clinics on stroke and head injury teams and neurodevelopmental teams for peds, but nothing prepared me for the trauma of cancer in my own life. Stories that I write from the perspective of patient and family member. Despite my personal and professional experience, I still consider myself an outsider. Being disabled and living with disability is still outside my lived experience, but I hope to be a good ally, and I'm constantly learning. I write about the clinical relationship, whether as clinician or patient, because I am interested in transference and countertransference, how we affect each other in the clinical space, how this often intimate relationship brings up things from our past and teaches us about our shared humanity. Poetry slows us down, makes us pay attention, the very skills required to be a good clinician, to be present in the moment. I started writing poetry because my patients started to read as poems to me. They told me their stories, and I heard poetry. I would like to talk about the medical gaze, which is the objectification of the patient by the medical professional. I'd like to look, by doing this, to look at the different models of disability or illness. And I'm referring to the work of Erin Andrews and Stella Young. There are overall three main lens or models of illness or disability. And it's important for us as writers, no matter our experience, personal or professional, to understand these three lenses and to look for bias, to constantly be looking for bias. There's the moral model, the medical model, and the social model. The moral model, the problem is related to moral weakness. This moral model is widespread, very prevalent, and nuanced. It sees disability or illness as weakness, or a failing, or sin, or the disabled, ill person as special. Illness is seen here through this lens as a lesson to be learned, or God's will, or a punishment, or the person has brought on the illness or disability themselves by being weak. Vulnerable bodies are seen as less than. We saw this in early COVID with jokes about the elderly and immune compromised, phrases like boomer eliminator, which is the intersection of ageism and this illness bias. We certainly saw it in the 80s with AIDS, which was the intersection of homophobia and a bias against illness. So even we have seen this time and time again, this bias against the vulnerable body. The moral interpretation of illness is why USAID, CDC, NIH, and WHO can get cut. It's this of not valuing the vulnerable body. It's when Robert F. Jr. Kennedy dismisses vaccines and says, and I quote, "It's very, very difficult for measles to kill a healthy person. We see a correlation between people who get hurt by measles and people who don't have good nutrition or good exercise regimen." Here's the fun fact: almost 90% of deaths from measles are from those under 5. So toddler exercise regime is just not a thing. Another aspect of the moral, I could go on, but I'm going to restrain myself. Another aspect of a moral lens is portraying disability or illness as special or inspiring. Stella Young coined the term inspiration porn, where the able-bodied use disabled bodies to inspire or feel good, such as images of the amputee marathoner or mountain climber. And here's a quote: "Images or stories of disabled persons with sentimental or motivational statements attached have the dual function of making the non-disabled feel better about themselves while simultaneously holding the average disabled person to an impossibly high standard." So always constantly be on the lookout for this very nuanced, whether it's romanticizing the illness or the disabled or vulnerable body, or diminishing. The other lens is the medical model. And the medical model sees the illness or disability as the medical condition. So the person is a problem in need of cure. Now, the word patient is indicative of this. Patient, passive, waiting. It's problematic, yet we don't have a better word. There was a time where a facility where I was working, they used shareholder, which is even worse. Language fails us here. In rehab medicine, we were taught to see our patients as people with potential that needed interventions to achieve their potential. And this was the bias that I have had to learn to overcome. Here is an example of my own ableism. For years, I described myself as an SLP, as a language mechanic. And I would even say, I'm a mechanic when there's a kink in the machine. Now, I'm a poet. I love this metaphor, but I literally objectified my patients. So not something I'm proud of, how long it took me to realize this. The medical model, of course, is necessary for diagnosis and treatment, but it's inadequate. To deconstruct the medical gaze is to see the disabled or ill person as whole and intact in their personhood and not broken. The social model, of course, looks at disability as an individual difference within the normal spectrum of diversity. Disability as a social construction. Environmental, structural, and attitudinal barriers hinder full participation in society. A person's illness or disability is only one aspect of their personhood, not the summation of who they are. Disability is part of being human, and access is a right. The first wave of disability rights was all about accessibility. We fought in the 70s and the 80s for wheelchair ramps. But now, the wave where we are now, it's moving from accessibility to disability justice. All bodies deserve to be safe and free. As simple as that. To summarize, there's benefits to the moral and the medical models. Hospital chaplains are busy. People want and benefit from spiritual support. We need to make a diagnosis and a treatment plan. But like in a poem, more than one thing can be true at the same time. We can do this. We can still see the patient as a whole and work together in treatment. So in my writing, I deconstruct the medical gaze a few ways. One, I try to place myself. Who am I? Why am I here? Why am I writing this? Whose story is it? So number one is to place myself. Number two, I try to center on the relationship to my own experience and to speak for myself and not to speak for the other person. The third is I'm always looking for my hidden bias. I consider those three lenses that I described, and I'm on the lookout for any moral tinge or judgment or objectification. And fourth, I write poems that may include stories of my patients, but sometimes the disability is not in the poem because it is not needed. There has to be a reason. For example, my first poem, Statistic. This was a patient of mine, but that's not what the poem is about, so it was not necessary to include that in the poem. So it comes down to cultural competence, which is not static. It's an ongoing, organic process of learning. Poetry has the superpower of point of view and storytelling. We get to use language to shift perspective and widen our understanding. Poetry deepens and widens my understanding, as my patients have. Why I write. Thank you. All right, now I'm going to turn off and we're going to hear from Risa.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. That was great. I really loved everything you just said. Um, so I'm part of that 120 years, however many years you added up. I've had a many decades long experience of working as a nurse practitioner, and a poet. I've worked in end-of-life care and palliative care for a lot of my career. And I've worked for many years when I lived in New York City, I was taking care of people with HIV and AIDS in the South Bronx. And I did that for a few years. And that was an introduction to what death is all about in my life. Currently, I volunteer to help people with life-limiting illnesses to end their life peacefully using medical aid in dying. So I was going to talk about how or why there's a reason to write poems that are deathy, that are about death and about loss. We all know about loss. Loss is universal. We all know about death, death of a pet, death of a spouse, sometimes the death of a child, death by cancer, death in war, or the natural death after a long life. There are particulars to each of these. They don't run into each other. Every death is its own death. Every loss, even if it's your wallet, is its own loss or its own struggle. And there are a lot of poems out there about these things, about grief and loss, grief, loss, death. They're kind of the triad. But how does it happen? How can you as a poet or I as a poet make poetry out of these experiences? If you're interested in writing poems about death and dying, I have one small piece of advice. Wait. Let your memories of grief and loss mature. But find poems that speak to you about loss. Find them, collect them, put them in a safe place so that when you find yourself in a certain mood, you'll have a collection of poems to go to for comfort. I'm going to I'm going to talk or read you some lines from a few poems that are my favorites and tell you why I happen to like them in terms of bringing me peace and bringing me comfort. One of my favorite poets is Emily Dickinson, and she captures the complex feelings of loss. Her poems are always so nuanced. They have so much of a mixture of love and sorrow and loss. All those things are always in every poem. One of the poems, though, that I love greatly is starts with the line, as her poems all do, after great pain, a formal feeling comes. And I'll read just the last stanza. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First, chill, then stupor, then the letting go. This poem has been really helpful to me in deciding it was time for me to let go of some old grief. And the letting go, the words letting go have just been very helpful for me in the writing that I'm doing now about losing custody of my son. And then there are poems that are just around and they seem easy, but they're just subtle, like Robert Frost's poems are. And this one is Nothing Gold Can Stay. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so for an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief, so dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay. I like the universality of this message. It brings us humans into nature, part of nature, but it expands our view and reminds us that nothing lasts, nothing, everybody dies, and it gives me a sense of equanimity. I think a very well-known poem is One Art by Elizabeth Bishop, the Villanelle that she wrote. And I've got two lines here. They're not together in the poem, but the art of losing isn't hard to master. That's the first line of the poem. And then a little bit later, then practice losing further, losing faster. And the poem kind of picks up speed with each kind of loss, some of them not so serious, and some of them getting more serious and more serious. And it builds momentum until she finally talks about how difficult it is to have lost a lover. I like the way she poses art as an artifice, but it's also a shield. She's protecting herself from loss and teaching us some ways of protecting our own selves when we feel loss and when these things come up and we don't we don't think we can handle another loss or this particular loss, but we manage to. In my own work, I've written a poem titled Elegy on the Morning of My Death, and the morning in this title is spelled Mourning. And it's an imagination, sort of a wish or a mantra for a peaceful and natural death, something we all want. Everyone wants to die in their sleep peacefully at an old age. And I want that too for myself and for all of you. And it ends on these lines. I pray to wake in my own bed, softly wrapped in the praxis of long having known this day would come. Then let my fresh carbon mingle with the coal of my ancestors. My very favorite poem about a loss is W.H. Auden's Funeral Rites, which is also another very well-known poem. And just one stanza of it that my memory's horrible, but I can remember these lines. It probably will for the rest of my life. He was my north, my south, my east, my west, my working week, and my Sunday rest, my moon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought love would last forever. I was wrong. I just love this poem. It says, and it goes on, and it says this is not reconcilable. Things will never be okay. And that's the feeling that you have at moments. And it's an honor to be able to look at somebody else's grief being so deep and knowing that you've been there too. Another poem that I've written myself was The Loss of My Best Friend to AIDS. And I'm going to read that. It's on page 85. And I'm reading this poem because I wrote it after the Auden poem. It was an homage to the Auden poem. It's called You Are. You are my kitchen. I can't make my eggplant dish without you. You dice the onion so I won't cry. You strike the match to light the oven. You are my breakfast. We drink coffee from jelly jars. I can't sweep the floors without you here. You are my critic, my lost amethyst string, my favorite berry, the knife that scrapes the pith of me, the toothy grin of the missing boy on the milk carton, my root beer float. You are the postcard of Calliope that you airmailed from Mykonos that other time you left, vowing to never return. And then the present of you, gifts of brisket, banter, side-splitting quarrels. I make rugelach every year on your birthday. You are my morning shower, my evening biscuit. The thing I like about this poem is the details, and it's just a way to tell you how to go about doing this. Collect details, write them down, make sure that they're rich and specific when you're trying to either just work through mourning or, I mean, it's what we do. We talk about the person and we tell stories. And in writing poems about loss, it's the same way. And I really think that it's the gathering of those details and the writing that has kept me working in healthcare for so long. I feel like the fact that I can write has made it possible for me to hold on to compassion through many years where I've seen a lot of medical providers really burn out or really even become cynical trying to work within the healthcare system. And like Michele said, the combination of being able to do one enriches the other. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Jed.
I'm going to be resonating with much of what we've heard from Michele and Risa. I've made some notes and called them notes on the clinical relationship in the context of creativity. And I'll just share the notes as they came to me. I was drawn to poetry and I was drawn to medicine, in my case, particularly psychiatry, because I wondered avidly about human nature. Maybe because I wondered about my own nature and wanted to see my personal struggles in as broad and forgiving a context as possible. Now, half a century later, I remain a student of human nature, that is, of the part of nature that takes this form: sapient, nurturant, anxious, too often violent, the males that is, and imaginative, indeed even inclined to believe in powerful, invisible presences, gods, angels, demons, and to fight and kill over them. I have been looking for what in this human nature is most essential. Is it the need and ability to love, or the capacity to risk hope, or the propensity to trust? Is the deepest need perhaps simply to belong securely as possible? Is the anxiety about belonging what gives rise to power mongering and greed? Is the anxiety about belonging what gives rise to trying to be useful? You see, 50 years exploring, observing, reflecting, as writer of poems, as listener to sufferers, as witness to ceaseless dramas, and still I have only questions. Well, maybe also a few propositions. I will say this and call it a finding. In caring for someone in distress, whether it's an arm or a heart or a spirit that's broken. Listening usefully calls for the holding of contradictions, like, I have always loved my mother and I have always hated her. Or, my father died when I was 10, and when my son turned 10, I left the house and never returned. Or, doctor, you must help me with my shame. I'm hiding it from you now best I can. I've come to believe that growth, healing, discovery, resolution, or resonant poetry can only come about when contradictions are embraced. The ER doc must not try to set the child's fractured arm despite his job description, as long as the child wails and writhes. First, physician, tune in to your patient's terror, inhale it, transmute it with care if you can, breathe it out with comforting sounds your patient can drift to. Then the therapist meets a family embedded in that one body in the chair across the room. That family goes on struggling with unresolvable fragments of trauma. No one's listening very well. No one's feeling heard. And now the therapist is feeling tremulous, somehow threatened. Not up to this. Okay, don't press. Like Risa says, wait. Is this a space where warring parts of a self are equally safe? Okay, I'm the therapist, still learning to take in the other's state bodily, physiologically, so as to be adequately intimate with the distress, so as to let the patient detect I'm holding their turmoil, so as to let something unfold that I still don't have in mind. It was John Keats, long ago, 1817, who wrote of the negative capability, that is, quote, capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Along the way, in my poetry practice and in my therapy practice, I found how difficult is this being in uncertainties, and how necessary for the as yet unknown to possibly emerge, for the poetic moment to come when I might see beauty shimmer on the tragic tide. I sit or walk with myself, my complex, multiple, warring self, and I wait, if I can, without pressing, in hopes of something resonant or revelatory settling out in the incessant inner struggle and becoming possibly sayable, writable, useful to the other, my listener, my reader, who has trusted me with their presence. And I sit with my patient, my friend, my son, who hides from me as much as longs to be seen. And, if possible, without anxious pressing, I wait, listen, then maybe I'll be granted a spontaneous synthesis of opposites, something sayable, perhaps useful, at least incrementally resolving. The late poet Dean Young wrote, quote, the highest accomplishment of the human consciousness is the imagination, And the highest accomplishment of the imagination is empathy. In our waiting, in our practice of the negative capability, alone as poets or with others as providers of care, maybe we are allowing our imaginations to serve empathy rather, that is, than serving our wishes, our fantasies, our fears, or our insistent beliefs. Wilfred Bion, who practiced and wrote on psychoanalysis, is famous for his exhortation to abandon memory and desire. This so as to have faith in the creative response, he wrote. I propose that sitting, waiting, listening, where complexity and contradiction border on chaos like surf on the edge of the sea, this is where we'll hear the deepest resonances, where mystery verges on sayable, writable, where in deepening empathy with oneself and or another, aloneness finds presence and the struggle itself becomes beautiful. I wish us all this inspiration and opportunity for such practice. Thank you.
Right. I think we're going to have a quick goodbye poem from each of us. And I will start, and then Risa, and then Jed. This poem, my goodbye poem, is a patient that I saw over 30 years ago. I've forgotten her name, but I remember the interaction and I hold it very close to my heart. Gift from the patient on 4 East. I remember you rubbing my belly with your good hand when I was full moon with child. The warmth of your palm radiating my midsection. I remember how the stroke left your shoulder torqued, your arm and hand chicken winged. You asked about the baby's name, and when I said Nathan, your hand found mine and you began to cry. This was not post-stroke lability, the gate of emotions unhinged, but grief from grief. In your aphasic skitter, you told me your son was Nathan, beautiful boy, dead from AIDS at 21, your only child. Nathan, gift from God. Decades later, I think of you, especially on his birthday. Cake, the sweep of breath, the candle out. Thank you. Risa.
Damn it, Michelle, you're making me cry. This is an homage to nurses, and it takes us all back to the early days of COVID. Elegy in the ICU. And I love nurses. I am a nurse, but I love all nurses and the nurses I've worked with throughout my whole career. Can't say that about all the doctors, but I can say it about almost all the nurses. Elegy in the ICU. To wake up each morning and once again choose to go to work. To grab a cup and a donut, to gown up, reuse your N95, add goggles and gloves, to feel lacking every time a call bell buzzes, to be a hand reaching out to say, stay, to watch the struggle and the surrender, to notify the family, to grip the phone while they sob, to not cry as you remove the tubes, to cleanse the body as tenderly as if she were your own mother, to cover her with a crisp white sheet. Thank you. All yours, Jed.
Thank you. I want to finish with the last poem in Can't Be Far. It's called Throat Singing. Let the breaking down go slow, I say, back in the throat, as if my prayer had any pull. Slow, so you and I could amble once more our little loop trail where rabbit, deer, coyote forage fallen apples under twisted lichened trees. Let us fall to our pieces slow, the half moon winking us its long hello above that row of poplars. Please let us wear down slow. Or ought I ask to bow out fast? No trouble for the ones I love, no half demented scuffle when I'm lost across the park. Yes, fast enough, no endless huffing toward the last exhausted breath. Now I'm left wishing just for love's presence, your hand that knows me, and let the clouds I see through the glass be my example how to join their slow, slow dance across the sky, the atoms spinning fast. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Jed. And thank you, Risa, and thank you, Michelle. That was just so wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of your beautiful poetry with us today and for those mini presentations as well. Those were just so fantastic and very inspiring. I learned a lot from all of you on how to reckon with illness and disability and loss as writers, specifically, and how our work with language and metaphor can be so powerful to change perspectives and also to answer big questions about human nature and care. We don't always think of clinicians as artists, so thank you all for being so thoughtful, such thoughtful stewards of your craft, both crafts, and sharing your 102 years. I love that 102 years of collective clinical experience with all of us. Thank you again for being here. And thank you to Mackenzie, GetLit's assistant coordinator, for all of their hard work today and behind the scenes leading up to today's event. Thank you also to student assistant Adam Westerholm and all of our MFA interns who help make the festival possible each year. To everyone watching at home, I hope that you'll join us for more festival events, both in person and here on Zoom. I also want to remind everyone at home that we have links embedded in all of our festival event descriptions that will lead you directly to our local indie bookstore, Auntie's. So you can purchase or pre-order all of the books by today's writers. Thank you to Auntie's for being our official festival bookseller. Please visit our website, getlitfestival.org, for our full schedule and more information about all of our authors, including today's talented writers. Thanks again for joining us, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.